The Chicago Bears have a healthy amount of salary cap space entering this offseason, but don't expect Ryan Poles to head into free agency and start spending big bucks on some of the top names.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. On the show today, we look ahead to free agency and why it's not going to be dead silent from the Chicago Bears by any means, but perhaps on the quieter side. Despite having some salary cap space to work with here, don't expect Ryan Poles to go out there and try and land the big fish and make the big splash free agent signings that really kind of put this team over the top. For a few different reasons we'll get into on the podcast today, having to do with guys themselves that are going to be free agency, how many players the Bears have to re-sign, and how quickly some of that cap space can go, especially when you've got, for example, a big fish waiting out there like Jaylon Johnson. And to me, that's really what this hinges on. The Bears have said repeatedly that they don't want to let Jaylon Johnson get away. Ryan Poles has implied that they're not going to let Jaylon Johnson get away. To me, that says at a very minimum, they will franchise tag him if they do not get a long-term contract extension done. Jaylon Johnson said recently, his heart is in Chicago, but his head and his mind is on the money, which is, of course, fair for Jaylon Johnson. But if we kind of operate under this assumption that one way or another, Jaylon Johnson will be a Chicago Bear in 2024, either via the franchise tag or a potential contract extension, that's going to cost this team a lot of money. And that, in either form, that contract is going to eat a significant amount out of this Bears cap space. So before we get to the Jaylon Johnson numbers, if you just look more broadly at the Bears cap space as it stands right now in early February, heading into free agency and the rest of this offseason, the Bears have, or are projected to have, $46.8 million in salary cap space overall. Essentially, we can just round it up to 47 and make it a round number there. Among NFL teams, that ranks, eighth most salary cap space, total cap space of any team in the NFL. When you also then apply the fact that, okay, they're going to need to save some salary cap space for all of their draft picks, and there's also there's certain salary cap machinations that work where only the top 51 contracts count against your salary cap in the offseason. So as you sign players, it kind of shifts how much salary cap space you actually have taken up. Our friends over at overthecap.com have what they call effective salary cap space, where they calculate, okay, how much will your draft picks and stuff cost, and how much money do you really have to wiggle room here and still have money set aside for all those other things. And that leaves them with essentially $35 million in effective salary cap space to send this offseason. Still ranks essentially the same, eighth most effective salary cap space they have to work with this offseason. $35 million is plenty of money to go out and sign players to contracts. But $35 million can also start to go very quickly when you start to look at Jaylon Johnson and what his situation might look like. Given how far apart the Bears and Jaylon Johnson have been throughout this negotiating process, I'm fully expecting that the Bears will end up using the franchise tag on Jaylon Johnson, that they will not be able to reach a long-term contract agreement between now and the start of free agency, and use that tag to make sure he stays around and give you more time to negotiate throughout the spring and the summer. It's possible they get a deal done, but I'm leading franchise tag right now. And if they use the franchise tag on Jaylon Johnson, That's projected. It's not set yet, but it's projected to be an $18.8 million franchise tag for the cornerback position this year. And so because it's a 1-year fully guaranteed franchise tag, that will take $18.8 million out of your salary cap space. So if let's just round numbers here and make that $19 million, since we're kind of rounding up the salary cap space as well. If you're taking $19 million out of the $35 million the Bears have in effective salary cap space, that leaves you $16 million left over to sign everybody else. Now, along the way, could you reach a long-term contract extension with Jaylon Johnson and then reduce that year one salary cap number from 18.8 down to something a bit more reasonable? Perhaps. And perhaps you could reach that contract extension with Jaylon Johnson and avoid the franchise tag altogether and have a smaller year one cap hit. But at the same time, it's going to be a potentially $20 million a year contract. It doesn't mean it's going to cost $20 million on the salary cap this year, but the less you put on the salary cap this year, the more you have to put on the salary cap in future years. So maybe you make it 15 this year or 16 this year, or you can go pretty darn low if you want to, as far as you can go 10 if you want to, but let's say a healthy number like 15 this year. That still leaves you with 20 out of your 35 million left in salary cap space to go out and sign other players. And that also includes, re-signing some of your own free agents and filling some of the needs that you have on this roster, either by re-signing some of your own guys or going out and trying to get veterans. Of course, you also have the draft as a means of filling some of those needs, but at the same time, you don't want to go into draft day feeling like, oh man, I have to draft a center because I just never got one in free agency, or I have to draft a top edge rusher because I just never got one in free agency, or whatever position you might make it. Like you'd like to have everything at least addressed in some way, shape, or form, even if it's not game-changing top-name players in free agency, so you can go into the draft with some flexibility. And when you add the Jaylon Johnson contract in, either the full franchise tag of about $19 million or a contract extension with a slightly lesser cap hit, you're still only looking at anywhere from $16 to $20 to $23 million in cap space to sign a good dozen or so players, and you start to spread that money out, it goes pretty quickly. If it's $1 million for a backup here and $1 million for a backup there and $5 million for an average starter there, I mean, that goes very quickly when we're talking a dozen or so players, maybe even more, as you go throughout the rest of this roster. The good news is there is also, and there will be ways that the Chicago Bears create additional salary cap space, so it's not just going to be purely the 35 minus Jaylon Johnson's contract, but you'll create some more room. But when you create more room, you may also create some needs as well. But I also think the way this free agent market is playing out at Bears positions of need, there might not be exactly those big-time splash expensive free agents that we think of as being the exciting move, and maybe a little bit more of a low-key free agency for Ryan Poles. We'll look at how to move the money around and what to expect from this year's free agent class next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at DoorDash, the best way to get all of your favorites delivered during the big game on Sunday. Whether you need something dropped off last minute before your party, or you run out of something during your party, you need more chips, more dip, more nachos, more wings, more pizzas from your favorite local restaurant, DoorDash is here to have it delivered hot, fresh, and ready right to your door. It's a great way to be able to support local restaurants, local businesses in your community that might not be able to have their own delivery staff. But with DoorDash, it's super easy to do in their app, and that money stays right in your community. Right now, you can get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter in our promo code LOCKED23. Subject to change, terms apply. Just don't forget that promo code, LOCKED23, for 50% off up to a $10 value on that first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more. This episode of Locked On Bears is also brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks, the best way to play daily fantasy sports, especially for the big game coming up on Sunday. It's exciting, it's easy, and you can change every game-changing moment into 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. That's $10 into $10,000 because PrizePicks sets projections for every player, and you decide whether they will do more or less than their PrizePicks projection. So they've got a special in for this Sunday. If Patrick Mahomes throws for more than 1 yard in the big game, you can win on PrizePicks. You just got to pair that up with a few other picks, and you can win big. It's a lot of fun, and it gives you some extra stakes in a game that you might not otherwise have a huge rooting interest for. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's an extra $100 to play with at prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Jaylon Johnson's contract, whether it's a franchise tag or a complete new deal, is going to take a big chunk out of this Bears salary cap space. But there's at least one obvious move we're expecting them to make that should create quite a bit more cap space. And there's a couple other moves around that could also create a little more wiggle room. And all of a sudden, there's some room to at least get quality players at a few positions, even if that doesn't necessarily open up for like the big splash free agent signing. So right away, you think, who could the Bears cut as a salary cap casualty? You look at this depth chart, it sure feels like Cody Whitehair is as good as gone from the center position, right? He's set to make a pretty significant chunk of change this offseason. If the Bears release him, they will gain around $9 million in salary cap space. Then they'll have a couple million in dead money. I think his cap hit would be around 12 or something in total. So right away, we already thought of center as a big need. Whitehair is still under contract. You cut him, you save an extra $9 million. So that frees up some extra space in there. The other thing is if the Bears do trade Justin Fields at some point in this offseason, a trade of Fields will create a few $1 million in salary cap space. Some of the structure of his contract doesn't end up on the Bears books, but ends up on the next team's book. It's about half of his cap hit this year. So you save about $3 million on a Justin Fields trade. Obviously, that's not a trade with the intention of trying to save him as much cap space as possible, but you just happen to get a few $1 million in there as well if the plan is to draft Caleb Williams. The big question mark that we still need to talk about a little bit more in depth this offseason is on defense. Eddie Jackson at the free safety position. One of the most expensive players on this roster, I think an $18 million cap hit. I don't know that he played like an $18 million player this season, but if you release Eddie Jackson, you have a big hole to fill at free safety. But if you release Eddie Jackson, you're going to gain $12.5 million in salary cap space. So between Whitehair, Jackson, and the Justin Fields trade, you're talking almost $25 million in cap space you could add to the existing $35 million that we're entering this offseason with. And then say you take out 19 still from the Jaylon Johnson franchise tag and or new contract. But if you're following along here with the math there, that's a little over $40 million in salary cap space that you would have to work with there. And so that's a nice chunk of change. Now, with that $40 million or whatever, that's if you cut Whitehair and Eddie Jackson. I'm not confident that the Eddie Jackson cut's going to happen. I think the Whitehair cut's going to happen, and the Justin Fields trade is likely to happen. Eddie, a little less clear to me. That one, I predict, honestly, if I had to guess right now, they'll work out some kind of contract extension and restructure with Eddie Jackson to lower that salary cap hit, add a year or two onto the contract, and push that money down the line, as opposed to cutting him outright or keeping him and spending the same amount on him. I think they'll save some cap space on Eddie Jackson without cutting him. That's my prediction, but we'll talk about that more in depth on a future podcast. But then you've still got a lot of needs to fill with anywhere from 30 to 35 or whatever $1 million in cap space that you might still have left over after the Jaylon Johnson and after the cuts and stuff that you make. You need a center to replace Cody Whitehair. And we'll go more in depth than the team needs to. But if we're just going just big picture here, this is not about to be a comprehensive list, but you could use a new starting center. You're going to need a number 2 receiver after DJ Moore. You'd like to have another defensive end opposite Montez Sweat. You'd like to have another interior pass rushing defensive tackle because Justin Jones is a free agent. Yannick Ngakoue is a free agent. Darnell Mooney is a free agent. Lucas Patrick is a free agent. And all of your tight ends not named Cole Kmet are all also free agents. And so I don't know that the Bears are feeling a super big obligation to re-sign Ngakoue or re-sign Justin Jones or re-sign Lucas Patrick or re-sign, Robert Tonyan, Rasheem Green, maybe Mercedes Lewis, but like of the Bears' own free agents, Jaylon Johnson's the big one, and everyone else is kind of like maybe if they're cheap, but not really a lot of high priority guys to go out and re-sign. Even Darnell Mooney feels like he may be on his way out to another team. And so if you're trying to go between like, okay, a center, a receiver, a defensive end, a defensive tackle, that's 4 starting caliber players you might want to try and pursue on the open market. And if you're trying to split up that between, say, $40 million, that's only about $10 million a piece. A $10 million contract is not big spending from Ryan Poles. And even then, like, you look at the centers, for example, it's not a center market. Centers generally don't get a ton of, free agent dollars on the open market. These aren't contracts that tend to be big bucks, for example, but maybe you have a priority to get a veteran center if you're anticipating having a rookie quarterback. It's guys like Connor Williams, who started with the Cowboys and then played for the Miami Dolphins, who had a pretty good season. He might get in the $6 or $7 or $8 million a year type range. There's the Raiders center, Andre James was decent this season. He could get in the $9-10 million a year type range. Tyler Biadasz from the Dallas Cowboys in that $7-9 million range. But like, this is not going to be the super mega contract. Centers just don't get that, even for some of the potential top guys in the market, who, by the way, still have to actually hit the market and not re-sign with their own teams between now and free agency. Same kind of thing at wide receiver, right? With DJ Moore under contract, the Bears are not going to go out and sign the biggest named number 1 receivers of the market. Even like a T. Higgins from the Bengals, like he seems to me like maybe a bigger name than the Bears might go after. It'd be cool to have T. Higgins, and I'd certainly see what the price tag might be there, but you need a guy who's been a bona fide 1,000-yard guy for another $20 million a year contract receiver to pay at the same amount as DJ Moore. I mean, I'm not sure that's quite the case, but you could still get a quality receiver out there, a number 2 guy like a Gabe Davis, or even Tyler Boyd from the Bengals was kind of their 3, but he could be a 2 in a lesser wide receiving core. I mean, these guys are not going to cost nearly as much as that like $20 million a year mark that a guy like T. Higgins might get on the open market, or even somebody like Mike Evans if he ends up getting outside of Tampa Bay. He's a $20 million a year type receiver in free agency. But if you could get a Tyler Boyd for $12 million a year or something like that, or even less, I mean, depending on how this ultimately plays out, he kind of had a down year. Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills, $12 or $10 million a year. To me, that's not like a big splash signing from Ryan Poles, but it's like a middle of the line, like, yeah, good player, decent price, okay, that can kind of work. And that's more what I'm expecting from the Chicago Bears in free agency. Like, not so much the Tremaine Edmonds set the market kind of contract for a big splash guy, but get a guy who can be a solid center, but maybe not the top center contract in the market. Get a wide receiver who can be a solid number 2 to DJ Moore, but not like a market-setting big-time wide receiver contract. The one potential exception to that is on the defensive line, but that's contingent on who actually makes it to free agency, and it still doesn't necessarily align exactly with how Ryan Poles likes to go about building this team. So we'll look at what that might look like on this defensive line and where and how the Bears could potentially try and fit that in the salary cap, if at all, with a lot of other spots to still fill in this roster. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy that is easy and convenient for everyone. Sometimes you need to get some stuff off your chest, and it's really important to be able to talk to somebody who's a true third-party arbiter in this sort of thing. Online therapy is a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen. I like to say I go to the gym, not because my body's broken, but because I want my body to be stronger. And I go to therapy, not because my brain is broken, but because I want my brain to be better and at its best. And BetterHelp is a great way to get started if you haven't done it before. Therapy can certainly be different for everyone. Most of us have big problems that are bigger than just our favorite sports team or what they're going to do in a free agency of the draft. And it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. So if you've been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. The one position where the Bears could be tempted to make a big splash in free agency is on the defensive line. I think particularly at the edge rusher spot, but also if there's an interior pass rusher that they truly fall in love with, like a Chris Jones from the Kansas City Chiefs, who has the Ryan Poles connection. That's the one spot where it's like, could they could they pass it up? But also it's like, can they actually afford that? Is Ryan Poles in a position to hand out a contract that might be $30 million a year? I mean, that's the kind of number you start to look at with somebody like Chris Jones, 4 years, $120 million type contract. And you kind of have to ask yourself where you are as a team. Is this the kind of signing that puts your defense over the top and is worth it to maybe leverage a little bit of your future for the present? Because it's hard to fit that kind of number on your salary cap. Like, we've been kind of talking about the numbers here, right? It's like, okay, you cut Whitehair, you trade Justin Fields, that adds $12 million to your cap space, but then, you're going to lose some caps. You're going to lose $19 million from the Jaylon Johnson deal, presumably in there. So all of a sudden you're down to less than, $30 million in cap space pretty quickly there. And if Chris Jones is going to be a $30 million a year type contract, it's not going to be a $30 million cap hit in year one, but the more you backload that, the more that's going to cost you down the line. So you start to push more money in the future. You're going to have less future cap space to sign guys and to give contract extensions to young players, like a Tevin Jenkins or other guys up, your cornerbacks and your safeties once they kind of get towards the end of their contracts. I mean, players are going to need to be paid eventually, and the more money you push in the future on Chris Jones, the less money you'd have to potentially pay those guys. But I mean, it's possible, I guess, but that implies that Chris Jones actually gets to free agency and that the Chiefs let him go. And I mean, you could start to have the same conversation about the edge rushers with a guy like Brian Burns set to hit free agency, or Josh Allen from the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, maybe Danielle Hunter, but I don't know if he's quite in the same category. Chase Young, the San Francisco 49ers, might maybe not be quite as expensive as those guys, but first they got to hit free agency. Then Ryan Poles has to decide if that's what he wants to do, because we've heard Ryan Poles say pretty much every offseason, right? The plan is not build the team through free agency. The plan is draft and develop, and then use free agency to supplement here and there to fill little holes where you need to, and kind of, fill in the cracks. And going out and spending big bucks on Chris Jones is not filling in the cracks. That's buying the pre-made house, right? That's buying the established product right there and really adding the sports car into the driveway. And it'd be exciting, and it would be a huge boost for this team. But it doesn't feel exactly like what Ryan Poles wants to do. And it also doesn't feel like the most financially responsible way to build this team right now. Because if you go out and sign Chris Jones to a $30 million a year contract, let's say, and even if you get that first year capped it down in half to $15 million, you're spending $15 this year on Chris Jones, plus say you get Jaylon Johnson down to $15 this year as well. So those two guys are taking $30 million out of your salary cap space. Then even if you take the Cody Whitehair cut and the Justin Fields trade on top of that stuff, you're still sitting there with $17 million to sign a center, a wide receiver, another tight end, maybe another interior defensive pass rusher, interior defensive tackle. Plus, you also need money to sign all the other backups on your team. Like, the Bears have 18 players entering free agency this year. You don't exactly have to replace all of them one-to-one because some of those guys were on injured reserve or whatever, but you're going to need probably a third-string quarterback, probably a number 4 running back, a number 2 and number 3 tight end. You're going to need a backup center in addition to the starter that you go out and sign. You're probably going to need another backup guard, another backup tight end, a couple more backup wide receivers. I mean, the only wide receivers you have under contract right now are DJ Moore, Tyler Scott, and Velus Jones. Maybe Scott and Jones can be your 3 and your 4, but you're still going to need at least a 5 and probably a 6. And ideally, you would like 1 or 2 players better than Velus Jones so that your number 4 wide receiver isn't Velus Jones. So it's a couple of wide receivers, a couple of tight ends, a couple of centers, and then more depth on defense as well. You're going to need a couple of linebackers at the very least, if not maybe a little bit more depth on the defensive line. And your secondary is pretty good on depth, but maybe you want a little more experience there. I mean, you start to add up, and it's like, okay, you might have, if you sign Chris Jones and Jaylon Johnson, you got $12, $15 million left to sign 15 different players, and that's like $1 million a piece, and that doesn't include guys who you need to have as starters. So then you have the conversation, okay, can we drop some salary cap space from Eddie Jackson? Can we restructure DJ Moore's contract to start to push some of that salary cap space even farther into the future? Or do you have to skimp at a few of these other spots and say, you know what? We can't get a very good center because we don't have the cap space. That's okay because you got Chris Jones, but you kind of got to pick and choose there. Or, could you take all that money you put into Chris Jones and get a better center and a better wide receiver and a lesser defensive tackle that's not as good as Chris Jones, but it's not like Chris Jones is the only good defensive tackle set to hit this open market. And we'll go through some of the specific guys at each position as we go through the offseason here, but like it's not Chris Jones or bust here, and you can rely on the draft for a few of these positions as well, but it only goes so far, right? You can move the money around a lot, and you can push money in the future, but like is 2024, if you're drafting Caleb Williams, is this the year to go all in on free agency, get that Chris Jones to put you over the top? Or are you still in more of a longer-term building mode here? And I know like Chris Jones can be part of a longer-term thing. You're not just signing him to as a one-year type guy. But, you know, he is 29. He turns 30 in July. Like, he's got another 3 or 4 years in him, but he's not he's not a 10-year guy on this team. He's a 5-year guy at most on this team. And so, like, it kind of depends on where the Bears see this window and how much Ryan Poles wants to go all in. And it feels to me like he's going to take the patient approach here. We saw it even last year. He didn't sign a bunch of big splash guys. He signed one. He went after Mike McGlinchey. It got too expensive. He said no. He went after Zach Allen. He got too expensive. He said no. He went after Daquan Jones? No, who's the Jones who ended up going to the Seattle Seahawks, the defensive lineman there? It's not Daquan Jones. I'm looking up Draymond Jones. Excuse me. Goes after Draymond Jones. Got too expensive, said no. Like, he pursued the big names, but didn't go all in on all the big names. And I imagine he'll take that similar approach this offseason. If Chris Jones hits the market, Ryan Poles is going to call. There's no doubt. But he's going to set a price limit and say, okay, we'll give you this much. And if you can get more somewhere else, we're out. We got other options. And I think we'll see more signings this year like we did last year. The TJ Edwards for $7 million a year. You know, it's DeMarcus Walker for $7 million a year. Those are not the headline-grabbing, big-name top free agents, but you hope that they can be solid guys at reasonable prices that outplay their contract. TJ Edwards this season outplayed his contract. DeMarcus Walker, not as much. But, you know, it's free agency. Like, teams don't hit on free agents. Free agency is never a home run. You win it on paper, but you never really see teams kill it in free agency every year. And the teams that spend a lot in free agency don't tend to take big steps forward, or at least not have sustained success from free agency. So Ryan Poles is going to take a draft-centric approach, use free agency more to fill little holes rather than go big on splash signings. That's my expectation for this offseason. I'd love to hear what you think the Bears are going to do. What is Ryan Poles going to do? Do you think it's going to be a quieter free agency, or could you see him going out and spending big bucks on somebody not named Jaylon Johnson? Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Come on back tomorrow as we keep things rolling with any and all Bears updates. Rumor is there may be a Devin Hester announcement coming this week. We're likely going to talk about Devin Hester after the news drops, potentially on Friday's podcast, and why he belongs in the Hall of Fame, whether he gets in or not. So come on back for that this week. As the week goes on, I should sound less nasally, as I think I got through like the peak of my cold was earlier today. Like last night into this morning and earlier today. I think I'm fingers crossed, I'm on my way down, so I'll hopefully sound better and better as this week goes on. And certainly my next week podcast should sound 100%. So appreciate you putting up with it. I don't normally sound like this if you're a new listener to the podcast, but what I do normally do is always make sure I finish with another opportunity for you to bear down.